right, for our reading commentary, let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 34. Again, a reminder that Jeremiah was raised up to preach to the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, the two tribes that remained before the Lord raised up Babylon to come down and take them into captivity. And already Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had two excursions down into Israel and taken a bunch of cities around Judah, but Jerusalem still stood. The temple was still there, but not for long. This is where there were false prophets in Jeremiah's day that kept prophesying that no, they didn't need to worry about it because they had the temple. Well, that temple had already been apostatized, and there was idolatry all around it and in it. And so it meant nothing for the Lord then to completely destroy it. So that's what we're reading here as we come down to these final kings of Judah. It says in verse 1, Jeremiah 34, the word which came unto Jeremiah from the Lord, and here's the timing, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army, and all the kingdoms of the earth of his dominion, and all the people fought against Jerusalem and against all the cities thereof, saying, thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, go and speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah, and tell him, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will give this city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. Now we're studying through Nehemiah right now, some 80 years after the decree went forth for Israel to come back out of captivity, and the walls of that city were still in ruins. But this was well before Nehemiah's time, when the preparation was being made for Babylon to come down and destroy the city. And it says in verse 3, thou shalt not escape out of his hand, but shalt surely be taken and delivered into his hand, and thine eyes shall behold the eyes of the king of Babylon, and he shall speak with thee mouth to mouth, and thou shalt go to Babylon. So here we see the Lord directing in all things in his sovereignty, even over wicked kings, and determining to use not only Nebuchadnezzar, but all the different kingdoms that were under his dominion at this point, to come down into Jerusalem according to God's command. Why was Nebuchadnezzar able to come down and fight against Jerusalem and take it? It's because God had so commanded. And we can see right on down to the very detail that's described here, this word that was given to Zedekiah, one of the last kings of Judah, that Nebuchadnezzar came down and took away captive. And when he says to him here, you shall not, verse 3, escape from his hand. Maybe there were some who thought, well, if we just pray enough, if we just seek the Lord enough, that somehow we can turn things around. The Lord is saying here that this would not be the case. He would be captured by the Babylonian king, and it was really Nebuchadnezzar that put Zedekiah in this place to begin with. He'd already come down and taken away one king and set Zedekiah up on this throne as his vassal king, as his servant king. But then he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and that's where the Lord's saying to Zedekiah, you're going to certainly see Nebuchadnezzar, not from a distance, but face to face. And so what the Lord determines is accomplished exactly as he says. That's where we see here in verses 4 to 5, the Lord making this promise to Zedekiah. Yet hear the word of the Lord, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. Thus saith the Lord of thee, thou shalt not die by the sword, Who is it that determines whether men live or die? You talk about a warfare, and it's brutal, especially back in this day. And yet, the Lord had already said that Zedekiah would be spared, that he would not die by the sword. But thou shalt die in peace, and with the burnings of thy fathers, the former kings which were before thee, so shall they burn odors for thee. And they will lament thee, saying, Ah, Lord, for I have pronounced the word, saith the Lord. So when he says that he would not die, it doesn't say he won't die, but he would not die by the sword. In fact, when we studied this in 2 Kings chapter 25, going through the kings, Zedekiah's sons were all killed in front of his eyes. So this again shows God's sovereignty. He spared Zedekiah alive to do what? To watch his very own sons being killed. And then they took and put out Zedekiah's eyes and then bound him with fetters and took him into Babylon. That's how Zedekiah would live out the rest of his days. First seeing his sons killed. You can read about that in 2 Kings 25, verse 7, but then having his own eyes being put out. When it says there, so shall they burn burnings of thy fathers, and with burnings of thy fathers, the former kings which were before thee, so shall they burn odors for thee. This was just saying that he would be remembered, but small consolation. That burning the incense on his behalf was a way that they did to lament those that had gone before. These were funeral fires that were lit in honor of those that died. And so he's saying to them that he would be remembered as a king, but little consolation when you consider how it was that he was to die. I think about people today burning candles for those that have died and gone on. Well, that burning of candles isn't going to help them at all, facing God's judgment. And so Jeremiah now, he has to bring this word to Zedekiah the king. Verses 6 and 7, Jeremiah the prophet spake all these words unto Zedekiah, king of Judah and Jerusalem. There are times where it's a blessing to be able to declare the word of the Lord. Other times it's a word of condemnation. In Zedekiah's case, that was it. But you see there, all these words. Jeremiah didn't hold back, even though this was the king. Declaring unto him what would take place according to the word of the Lord. And when the king of Babylon, his army, fought against Jerusalem and against all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish and against Azekah, for these defense cities remained of the cities of Judah. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar had already come down previously and had destroyed a number of defense cities, but here were some more that remained, and those also would be taken out. Nebuchadnezzar was using strategy to be able to come down and then ultimately take Jerusalem. Here we see a combining of God's sovereignty and purpose and will with the strategies of men. Nebuchadnezzar didn't know how it was that the Lord had delivered Jerusalem into his hand, or would. And so he's fighting his battles like a general would, planning and plotting and strategizing, and yet it was the Lord all along that was determining the outcome. And many, many people, many, many casualties as a result of these excursions or these incursions into the land of Judah. And so in verses 8 through 11, we read, This is the word that came unto Jeremiah from the Lord, after that Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people which were at Jerusalem to proclaim liberty unto them, that every man should let his manservant and every man his maidservant, and being a Hebrew or a Hebrewess, go free, that none should serve himself of them, to wit, of a Jew his brother. Now when all the princes and all the people which had entered into the covenant heard that everyone should let his manservant and everyone his maidservant go free, that none should serve themselves of them any more, then they obeyed and let them go. See, this was according to the law anyway, that whenever somebody had a debt and had to indenture themselves unto somebody else, there was those years of Jubilee, that every 7 years, those that were indebted were to go back to their own homes and their own land and no longer be in slavery, indentured to these other masters because of their debt. But here, the reason this is mentioned is because time had gone on where no longer anybody was following that rule. Corrupt power and politics kept people as slaves, indentured. And so we're not sure exactly when this occurred. It says here that after King Zedekiah had made a covenant, but likely he was probably trying to clean house a little bit, thinking that this would be a way somehow to free up the people. And so he proclaimed an emancipation for the Hebrew slaves in Judah. Turned them loose. Maybe he thought by that if they were no longer slaves and they were free, that somehow they could think well of him and fight for him whenever Nebuchadnezzar came into the land. But none of this would change the outcome. Here it says that they obeyed and they let go free to return these slaves, those that had been indentured. But you see in verse 11, afterward, they turned and caused the servants and handmaids whom they had let go free to return. Those that had been masters, seeing that the slaves were going free, now all of a sudden they go after them and say, no, this isn't working. We need you for our fields. We need you for our own economy. And so they brought them into subjection again as servants and handmaids. All this is to show that the true heart of this people, it wasn't upon the Lord or his law or dealing righteously with one another. But no sooner had they agreed to let these people go than they went after them. Perhaps they thought that since there wasn't an immediate attack of Nebuchadnezzar on Jerusalem, and after letting them go, they thought, well, wait a minute, there's no imminent judgment here, because when Jeremiah's prophesying this, we were still several years away from Nebuchadnezzar coming down and taking them captive. And it may have been that for a while, when Nebuchadnezzar put a siege on Jerusalem and then withdrew, because that's how he did it, then they probably got emboldened again, thinking, well, we're going to go back to our regular lifestyle, disregarding the law of God, even with regard to how to treat their slaves. And so in verses 12 through 16, therefore the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondmen, saying, at the end of 7 years, yet let ye go every man his brother a Hebrew, which hath been sold unto thee, and when he had served thee 6 years, thou shalt let him go free from thee. But your fathers hearkened not unto me, neither inclined their ear. And ye were now turned, and had done right in my sight, in proclaiming liberty every man to his neighbor, and ye had made a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name, but ye turned and polluted my name. and caused every man his servant and every man his handmaid, whom ye had set at liberty at their pleasure, to return, and brought them into subjection to be unto you for servants and for handmaids. So the Lord uses this as a word against them, comparing his faithfulness and how he had dealt with them and his faithfulness from the time he delivered them from Egypt. Never went back on his word. And yet here they were disregarding his word and turning around again, and he describes it there as profaning his name. Ecclesiastes, Solomon spoke of this. Don't speak inadvertently and make vows to the Lord and say you're going to do such and such and then not do it. And then say, well, I didn't really mean it. That's not how the Lord deals with us. It's based upon a sure word, and thankfully it's so. When he made a covenant with his son to save a people, he's never gone back on that word. He didn't free his people through the death of his son, then turn around again and put them back under bondage under the law. And so their acting, what they were doing, was inconsistent with who he is as God. And therefore God again reminds them for that they would be brought into judgment. You don't trifle with the Lord's word and play with it and use it to your advantage. No, everything written here is to God's glory alone. And so verse 17, therefore thus saith the Lord, ye have not hearkened to me in proclaiming liberty, every one to his brother and every man to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim a liberty for you, saith the Lord. You want me to deal with you as you deal with one another? Well, here's the proclamation. You'll be freed, but it'll be to the sword. It'll be to the pestilence. It'll be to the famine. And I will make you to be removed unto all, or into all the kingdoms of the earth. So the Lord, again, as the just judge, is exonerated. He's glorified in this judgment that he's bringing against Israel, because they prove by their words and by their ways that they have no righteousness in them. Again, it's a reminder of what we are. We have no righteousness. We're God to mark iniquity, who could stand? But he's here pronouncing this judgment on them. And so verses 18 to 22 is the punishment. I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, which have not performed the words of the covenant, which they had made before me, when they cut the calf in twain and passed between the parts thereof. So there was a sacrifice made and a calf cut in half, and this was what the word covenant means. It means to cut in half. The princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests and all the people of the land which passed between the parts of the calf. I will even give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of them that seek their life, and their dead bodies shall be for meat unto the fowls of the air, heaven, and to the beasts of the earth. And Zedekiah king of Judah and his princes will I give into the hand of their enemies, and in the hand of them that seek their life, and into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which are gone up from you. Behold, I will command, this is God's sovereignty, I will command, saith the Lord, and cause them to return to this city, and they shall fight against it, and take it, and burn it with fire, and I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without an inhabitant. See, that's the part there where something took place here between the time that they agreed to let all these slaves go back free, and then now when it says, I will command, saith the Lord, and cause them to return to this city. So there seemed to be a time where Nebuchadnezzar pulled back. And they took advantage, thinking, oh, well, we're free. Let's go back to what we were doing. And that's where the Lord said they'll fight against it and take it and burn it with fire. And I will make the cities desolate of Judah, desolation without inhabitant. That's how unconverted hearts reason. They don't see immediate judgment. It's like Pharaoh. Once the plague stopped, then His heart was hardened. And people are like that today. Whenever there's trouble, they all get religious and start thinking, well, we got to get right with God. And then when there's not an immediate judgment, what do? Go right back to the way they were living before. There's a covenant that God has made with his Son. And the scriptures tell us, kiss the Son lest he be angry with thee. You don't trifle in matters of his Son. That covenant with regard to the gospel, you don't jump in and out. You're either bowed to Christ as he's revealed in that covenant that God made with him, or else there remains nothing but condemnation that awaits. But a very somber and a very solemn portion of Scripture as we read it here. Gracious Father, thank you for your word. I thank you that we can read this with some measure of peace, not because of anything in us, but because of that covenant that you have made with your Son, whereby he came and bore the sin of that people that you gave him. And so complete was that work that there remains nothing but righteousness that you have imputed already to their account, and thereby there's no condemnation. But to all others, those that trifle with your word or disregard what you have to say and think that somehow they can live to their own pleasure without giving you glory, that somehow they can escape judgment. Such would be our case were it not for your Spirit drawing us, teaching us, bringing us to bow to Christ. So I pray as we spend the rest of the time in your word that you would indeed cause our hearts and minds to look to Christ alone. And we give you the thanks and praise for his great work accomplished there at Calvary for sinners such as we are. Amen.